Good morning, good evening. Welcome to week 3 of PSH 6240 here at George Washington University. And I want to start by thanking all our wonderful lawmakers here in DC who have shut down the government. I don't know what I'm going to be doing on Monday, but our congressional leaders have great wisdom, and there's sarcasm in that if you didn't detect it. But going on to week 3 announcements. So our WebEx session is 25 January, this Thursday, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. When you acknowledge this email, let me know, or this YouTube, let me know if you will be in attendance. And for Group 1, please give me your PowerPoint slides beforehand so I can upload them to WebEx. But you have the URL, you have the password. So again, mandatory if you're briefing, optional if you're not. Paper due next Sunday. So Sunday 11:59 papers due. I am not going to be happy if I get an excuse at 11:50 on Sunday night about the paper. I do say grading in there. The one thing I just want to say is the paper is graded a lot harder than your discussion sections. In discussions, I give you a little bit more room to be leeway. Papers are going to be graded a lot harder. So current events. I didn't get to it last week, but the missile test in Hawaii, and this is related to the overall Homeland Defense curriculum that you are in. Text alert went out. That was wrong. I think everyone here is aware of it, and it caused mass panic for 30 minutes. It brings up a point about these text alerts. I'm a fan of them. They're used more so for weather, for other natural disasters. But yeah, the text alerts are a great way to get messages out. Obviously, this was a catastrophic issue that happened, and it still begs the question, okay, I've heard it was one person's operating error on this. Well, if it's one person making such a mistake that could have had cataclysmic disasters, what does that say about the system? That it's up to one person's judgment or one person's error, or if that one person had a bad day, what does it say about the overall system that can cause such panic? And that's just something to consider going forward. And then finally, the briefings. Again, the PowerPoints, please make them PowerPoints. Your PowerPoints should be clear for the briefing team. They should use lots of pictures, less words, and try and convey a message. So I look forward to briefing 1 or Group 1's briefing this Thursday. So review of last week. Example paper. So I sent out an example paper with this YouTube or in the announcements. So go ahead, pause me, and go to that example paper so you get a good look of what you're looking at. Okay, so welcome back. And what I think you should have gotten from that example is I want you to choose your argument points. And a lot of you have brought out argument points in this in the week 2 discussion. What are the controversies? Explore in depth and choose 2, 3, 4 max. I don't want laundry lists. And go in depth on those on your paper topic. The one thing I will say is, I gave you 4 groups. If you want to deviate from that, if you want to choose a group or an event outside of that, let me know. Don't just do it. Let me know beforehand so I can approve it. I'm more likely to, if it's related to the readings and the documentaries that we did in the last week. So don't just choose a group out of thin air there. If you want to go outside the assigned assignment, then go ahead and let me know. But argument points. These are what I want you to pin your argument on. And some of the ones that have come up in this last discussion. Military versus non-military. I think we've had a lot of heated discussion on this. And I think there was actually some erroneous things put out. I just want to make sure that's clear. the NCTC definition clearly says non-combatants, or terrorist attacks against non-combatants. A lot of you confuse that in the discussion section. But military versus non-military. Should targets that are military, and I'm talking about the Fort Hood, Pentagon, the USS Cole, should those really be considered terrorism? And what separates that from an IED attack in Iraq? Again, just things to get your mind stimulated on this topic. Combatant versus non-combatant. Ironically, when I taught this class 2 years ago, there was no distinction. Everyone assumed military and combatant. And then one of the students, and I've had a lot of students since then, make that distinction, that a civilian, Nadal Hassan was terrorists, was because he killed non-combatants or civilians at that Fort Hood processing center. The Pentagon was full of civilians. However, are they really non-combatants? If you're a civilian facilitating military movement overseas, are you really a non-combatant? If you're a civilian factory worker in a making aircraft carrier or aircraft parts, are you a non-combatant? If you work at the Pentagon, are you really a non-combatant? Again, just something to think about. State versus non-state. And this was, a lot of people mentioned this, that a non-state actor was more likely to be associated with terrorism. But, again, I just want to emphasize, states, Iran particularly, and others, they use proxies to sponsor terrorism. So they use proxies to sponsor terrorism, and that is a state-based terrorist. So again, you can't just say state versus non-state. Targeting within or outside the locus of conflict. That is a key point of what separates a terrorist group from not. For example, the FLN in Algeria, they did not target Paris. The Irgun did not target London with bombings. Does that certainly builds your credibility if you stay within the locus of conflict? It lets you know that you're fighting a war in a war zone as opposed to deliberate targets against civilians. Attacking the apparatus of government. In the Irgun documentary, you saw it where you're attacking the apparatus of oppression. You can say that. If you're attacking, again, I could say there's a huge difference between attacking military, government officials against that you have a disagreement with, versus blowing up a pizza parlor or a bar mitzvah or obviously a civilian target. One might be classified as legitimate violence, while the other may or may not, depending on your definition, should be classified as terrorism. War zone versus non-war zone. This goes to the point about locus of conflict, but I just want to bring this up. And a lot of you did bring this up, and I want to counter it. So the IED in Iraq, blowing up a Humvee, that a lot of you said that's okay because that's not terrorism because that's in a war zone. So I want to make it clear, we are saying it's a war zone, the United States. Arguably, Fort Hood, especially for processing soldiers going overseas, is a war zone. If you think Nadal Hassan is a soldier of Allah, like he had on his business cards, and you think he's a combatant or he's part of a war, then Fort Hood is probably in the other guy's war zone. If you're going back to Iraq example, if you're targeting a guy in his house who placed an IED the previous day, and you target him in his house, for him, his house is not a war zone. That IED in that road is a war zone, but not his house, not where he lives, not where his family is. But we certainly think that's a war zone. We could certainly raid his house. We certainly have. So what is a war zone? What is not a war zone? Political narrative. This is one thing I think, as I mentioned, separates terrorists from a criminal act, but arguably everyone has a political narrative. The Newtown shooter in Connecticut, he had a political narrative. The Aurora, Colorado guy, arguably he had a political narrative. So what separates a political narrative than maybe something that's some sort of psychosis? Levels of oppression. This is something I brought up in the question I tried to prompt you with. Certainly, if you're facing extermination like the Jews did in World War II, or the Hutu or the Tutsis did in the Rwandan genocide, certainly you get to do things. You get to engage in violence as part of self-defense in some way. Now, what do you get to do? Do you get to target the people that are actually trying to kill you? Easier said than done, because they probably have sophisticated weapons and you don't. Or do you target the civilians to increase the cost for their genocidal behavior? And at what level do I get to do that? Where on the oppression spectrum? Because again, I get a personal opinion. I think if you're being oppressed, like the Jews were in the Holocaust, or the Armenians were in the First World War, you get to do things. Okay, let's go walk that down the oppression scale. What about if you're a victim of slavery, like prior to the American Civil War? What about if you're a victim of apartheid prior to in South Africa? What if you're Jim Crow in the United States? What if you're a Palestinian in the occupied territories? Where do you get to commit violence? Where on that line do you get to kill people? So at what level of oppression? Politically popular versus non-popular. I think this kind of separates an insurgency versus a terrorist attack. If there's some sort of popular underpinnings for the actions, arguably it's a counterinsurgency. If it's non-popular, then it probably should be considered a terrorist act if it's a one-off area where there's no mass public support. Degree of association. Are you really associated? Is Omar Mateen, the guy who did the Orlando shooting, really associated with ISIS just because he pledged to ISIS after he was done? How associated? So ISIS is a known terrorist group, but if I'm radicalized over the internet, am I associated with ISIS? Or am I just someone who probably has a mental disorder and I'm just inspired by ISIS? If I'm in the ISIS chain of command, if, like Fort Hood, Nidal Hassan actually exchanged emails with the leader of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, does that make him associated? Well, or are those emails just kind of not really direct emails? They're more spiritual fanboy emails, not direct plotting. What crosses the line? When are you now associated with terrorism? All things to consider as you're going to write this paper. So I want to make sure that's kind of clear from the onset. So the paper, again, this is the meat of it. Intro, brief intro. Get to your argument. Rebut. Analyze the counter arguments and rebut them, and if necessary, give policy recommendations. And you saw the format that I provided in the test paper. So just illustrative examples. Irgun, highly oppressed, I think so, because they were in the backdrop of the Holocaust. They focus on the apparatus of oppression. Their targets were primarily the English government, and it was within the locus of conflict. So you can say the Irgun's a terrorist organization, but some of those factors, I think, mitigate it. The FLN in Algeria, which you saw the documentary on, highly oppressed, and you saw the documentary where they said the French took all the arable land in Algeria. Before oil, all you had was arable land, and if the French had it, you couldn't even feed your people. So arguably that's highly oppressed. The FLN focused on civilians. They killed a lot of civilians. Don't get me wrong, they were nasty, nasty characters. But it was within the locus of conflict. It was in Algeria. They never took their fight to Paris or the French mainland. Al Qaeda, and this is talking about pre 9/11 Al Qaeda with Osama bin Laden, not really oppressed. Their motivations were that the American military was in Saudi Arabia, but certainly they weren't part of some sort of colony or genocide. They focused almost exclusively on civilians, and they certainly went outside the locus of conflict. So their problem was in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East and American presence. They certainly, extended that battle when they took it to 9/11, and that probably begs the argument or pushes the argument that they're a terrorist group. So I hope I've given you enough to go with your paper on this. If there's questions or issues, please let me know. So week 3 preview, Terrorism History Part 2, Road to 9/11. Excellent documentary that we've put together. The Zakaria article, that's the seminal article after 9/11. Why do they hate us? And they're responsible not just for 9/11, but you saw some anger in the Muslim and the Middle East, particularly in the Arab world. And Zakaria tries to explain why. And then ask, as you're going through the documentary and the Zakaria article, what are the social, political, demographic, historical, cultural factors that facilitated kind of that anger? And then terrorism finance, focus particularly on ISIS finance, how ISIS financed itself and how we've mitigated it through the Newsweek article I sent. So if there's any questions or issues, please let me know, and I look forward to Thursday and seeing you guys in the WebEx session.